Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to give my review of WCW's Bash at the Beach 2000. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Lieutenant Loco versus Juventud Guerrera. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Loco and Guerrera, with Loco keeping the pace of the match. And Loco ultimately hits the finish on Juventud Guerrera, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Lieutenant Loco. Hats off to Lieutenant Loco for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Hardcore Championship. It is Norman Smiley versus Big Vito. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Smiley and Vito, with Smiley keeping the pace of the match. But Vito ultimately picks up the victory over Norman Smiley. Hats off to Big Vito for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Daphne versus Miss Hancock. I thought it was an awful match. Back and forth matchup between Daphne and Miss Hancock, with Daphne keeping the pace, and Daphne ultimately picks up the victory over Miss Hancock. Hats off to Daphne for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Chronic versus Perfect Event. I thought it was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between Chronic and Perfect Event, with Chronic keeping the pace of the match. And Chronic ultimately hits the finish on Perfect Event, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Chronic. Hats off to Chronic for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Kanyon versus Booker T. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Kanyon and Booker T. Jared is here. Jared ends up hitting Booker T with a guitar. Kanyon then hits a diamond cutter, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Kanyon. Hats off to Kanyon for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Championship. It is Mike Awesome versus Scott Steiner. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Awesome and Scott Steiner, with Awesome keeping the pace of the match. And Awesome ultimately hits the finish on Scott Steiner, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Mike Awesome. Hats off to Mike Awesome for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the Demon versus Vampiro. I thought it was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Demon and Vampiro, with Vampiro hitting the finish on the Demon, pins for 3, and your winner of the match is Vampiro. Hats off to Vampiro for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Shane Douglas versus Buff Bagwell. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Shane Douglas and Bagwell, with Douglas keeping the pace of the match. And Shane Douglas ultimately hits the finish on Buff Bagwell, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Shane Douglas. Hats off to Shane Douglas for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Jeff Jarrett versus Hollywood Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. Number one, I thought this was an awful match. Jarrett just lays in the middle of the ring while Hogan goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Hulk Hogan. After the match, Hogan grabs a microphone and says this is one of the main reasons why this company is going out of business. But hats off to Hulk Hogan for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Kevin Nash versus Goldberg. I thought it was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Nash and Goldberg, with Nash keeping the pace of the match. But Goldberg hits a jackhammer on Nash, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Goldberg. Hats off to Goldberg for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Jeff Jarrett versus Booker T for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. Looks like there was some kind of confrontation with Hogan backstage. And maybe that's the reason why we got a World Heavyweight Championship match in the main event at Bash at the Beach 2000 between Jeff Jarrett and Booker T. The match itself was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between Jarrett and Booker T, with Booker T ultimately hitting the finish on Jeff Jarrett, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW World Heavyweight Champion, is Booker T. Couple of things I'm going to say about Bash at the Beach 2000 before I get out of here, man. Number one, was it an okay event? No. It was decent at best. There was a lot of matches on this card I could have done without. Daphne versus Miss Hancock, awful matchup. And honestly, the biggest one for me was Hogan versus Jarrett. I mean, this was a moment in history for WCW where, you have Jarrett in the ring with Hogan. Jarrett literally lays on the mat, allows Hogan just to cover him for the 1-2-3, and Hogan gets the win in the match. And you have Hogan grab the microphone and says, "This is one of the reasons why this company is going out of business, because of stuff like this." And I mentioned this multiple times in the past, before, that from the years of, I would say, mid to late 1999 all the way up to 2001 for WCW, you can tell that there's a decline in pay-per-view buys, the pay-per-view itself, the lack of booking, the storylines were awful. The crowds were starting to dissipate a lot more than what it was in the early days of 1995 when Nitro was around. The crowd, it wasn't sold out shows, so a lot of fans at that point can see that WCW really wasn't going anywhere fast, and a lot of those fans from WCW were gravitating towards WWE because they were the better product at that time. So, with that being said, though, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10, 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give Bash at the Beach 2000 a solid rating of a 3.5 at best. But this is my review of Bash at the Beach 2000. I hope you guys are out there staying safe, be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.